Thank you very much. Tracy? I think Tracy deserves a big round of applause for unbelievable leadership. Unbelievable leadership by Tracy, and visionary leadership. And thanks for your kind comments and welcome. And thank you all. Good morning. Morning. I'm very happy to be here. Before I begin my prepared comments and remarks, let me say that the work that I do and that the BC Lions are doing, which is a really incredible positive step forward for all of us, the work that a growing number of men in a multicultural sense here in Canada and throughout North America and internationally all over the world, the growing movement of men who are finally taking the leadership from women, stuff that we've learned from women, and going into parts of male culture that have historically been either apathetic about or openly hostile to women's efforts to engage them on these issues. That growing movement of men, which I think is transformative, is indebted clearly to the leadership of women on every level, intellectually, politically, personally, and every other way. And I say this because I know that, like the BC Lions, who have been doing great work, and the partnership with EVA is a great partnership, and my work and a lot of other men's work, we get, some high-profile attention and acknowledgement of our work, and that's a nice thing. And it's part of the work, to be honest with you, getting in the media and getting the acclaim and getting the 88 million views and all that is an important part of the work. But at the same time, I know that a lot of women in the work don't get anything like the acclaim that we get and the support that we get and the acknowledgement and the gratitude. And so I think it's important, I know it's important, when men like ourselves have the microphone to say, women's leadership made all this possible, and thank you, and the unacknowledged leadership of women and work of women is really the foundation on which all of this is built. So thank you very much for all that. And I want to make another subsidiary point to that point, which is it's often seen as women's work is helping women and girls. This is a misnomer. It's helping men and boys as well as women and girls. So the women who built the battered women's movement and the rape crisis movement and the movements against sexual abuse of children and all these other related movements, that work is helping boys and men in profound ways. And oftentimes people don't say that out loud. They'll say something like, it's not just a women's issue, it's everyone's issue. It's like, who else is there, right? It's another way of not saying it's a men's issue, but in terms of who it's affecting in a positive way, I think we need to also say that men and boys are profoundly affected in a positive way by the work that women have been doing in creating these movements and creating the services for victims and survivors in treatment and creating better, offender accountability and developing prevention initiatives. All of this is a hugely positive influence on the lives of men and boys, both because we care about women and girls and because we care about ourselves and our sons and other men and boys who are profoundly victimized by the abuse that we are here to talk about, right? It seems like an obvious point, but a lot of stuff that's profound is just obvious once you hear it out loud. Don't you think? I mean, honestly, I think one of the things that I do in my work is I travel all over the world and I state the obvious, and people thank me for it. And I get paid for it usually, which is it's a good gig. But so I'm very happy to be here and with you this morning. I'm going to make a few comments and give you some sort of frameworks to think about the issues that we're all working on. And you're going to hear from some of my cohort in the BC Lions and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in short order. Now, a big part of my work is helping to create a paradigm shift in people's thinking about issues that have historically been considered women's issues. So domestic and sexual violence and sexual harassment, sexual abuse of children, I'll use the term gender violence or gender-based violence to shorthand it, but those issues have historically been seen as women's issues that some good men help out with. And that's the status of most people's thinking, even to this day. Women's issues that some good men help out with. And I'm going to argue, of course, that these are men's issues. Of course, they're also women's issues. And we know that, as I've just said, women have been the leaders and will continue to be the leaders in all of this. But calling gender violence a women's issue is part of the problem. And I'm going to share with you several reasons why it's part of the problem. The first part of the problem is that it gives men an excuse not to pay attention. A lot of men hear the term women's issues and we tend to tune it out. We think, hey, I'm a guy, that's for the girls, that's for the women. And a lot of men literally don't get beyond the first sentence as a result. It's almost like a chip in our brain is activated and the neural pathways take our attention in a different direction when we hear the term women's issues. This is also true of the word gender, because a lot of people hear the word gender and they think it means women. So they think that gender issues is synonymous with women's issues. There's some confusion about the term gender. And let me illustrate that confusion by way of analogy. And I'm going to use the United States, my home country, as a reference point, but you can plug in Canadian analogs, of course. Let's talk about race for a moment, okay? So in the United States, when we talk about race, a lot of people think it means African American, Latino, Asian American, Native American, South Asian, Pacific Islander. Or people, when they hear the word sexual orientation, they tend to think it means gay, lesbian, bisexual. And when people hear the word gender, they tend to think it means women. In each case, the dominant group doesn't get paid attention to, right? As if white people don't have some sort of racial identity or belong to some racial category or construct. As if heterosexual people don't have a sexual orientation. As if men don't have a gender. This is one of the ways that dominant systems maintain and reproduce themselves, which is to say the dominant group is rarely challenged to even think about its dominance, because that's one of the key characteristics of power and privilege, the ability to go unexamined, lacking introspection or self-awareness, in fact being rendered invisible in large parts of the discourse or the conversation about issues that are often about us, at least in part and sometimes centrally about us. And it's amazing how this works in the field of gender violence. I'll give you some examples of the kind of language that we use when we talk about these issues that has the effect of keeping our attention off of men. So you'll hear people say things like, how many women in BC were raped last year, not how many men raped women. You'll hear somebody say, how many teenage girls in the Vancouver School District were harassed or abused last year, not how many boys harassed or abused girls. Or how many girls harassed or abused girls. You'll hear people say in BC, how many teenage girls got pregnant last year. You won't hear people say how many men and boys impregnated teenage girls. In each case, the use of the passive voice has a very powerful political effect. The political effect is the shift in focus off of men and boys and onto girls and women. Even the term violence against women is a term that I honestly don't use unless I'm critiquing it. What's missing from the term violence against women? Men, in other words, in linguistic terms, the active agent is absent. It's a bad thing that happens to women, violence against them, but nobody's doing it to them. They're experiencing it, kind of like the weather, but nobody's really doing it to them. So if you insert the active agent, men, you have a new phrase, men's violence against women. It doesn't roll off the tongue as easily, but it's more accurate, isn't it? And it's more honest, isn't it? And by the way, I know there's women's violence against women. There's mother-to-daughter child abuse, there's female-to-female peer-to-peer lesbian battering, and there's female-to-female harassment, abuse, and violence of other types. I appreciate that. But the vast majority of violence against women is done by men, and the overwhelming majority of sexual violence against women is done by men. That's a fact, but you wouldn't know it from the term violence against women, because there's no men in that term. So you insert the active agent, men's violence against women. You're being more honest, you're being more accurate, but you know what happens, and a lot of the women in this room know what happens when you're accurate and honest about this subject matter. Some men get really, really defensive in the face of honest language about this subject. And by the way, some women sometimes get defensive for men in what I would consider a misguided attempt to defend men from an attack of the truth. And I'm not, by the way, blaming any women who choose to use gender-neutral language in your work, in your day-to-day life. I understand, appreciate, over the last couple of decades, a lot of women in the domestic and sexual violence field have said, you know what, I have to work successfully with men in law enforcement, in government, in human services, in any number, and in personal life. And a lot of women will say, you know what, I don't want to get into an argument every time. I don't want to be seen as being one of those male bashers or something. And because I need to serve the victims and survivors that I'm charged to serve, and that's my main goal here, a lot of women will back off and say, you know what, it's not worth it. It's not worth getting into these struggles every time, or maintaining these relationships and these partnerships is more important. And I'm not criticizing women for that at all. That would be totally inappropriate for me to do that. But one of the things that men can do, one of the things that we can do, is we can say some things that women can't sometimes say, or better yet, we can be heard saying some things that women sometimes can't be heard saying. And I know that that's frustrating. I know that a lot of women are very frustrated by that. I appreciate that, but it's true. It's a fact. And the success of the BC Lions EVA partnership is an example of that. It's like leveraging powerful men's voices to say what many of us have been saying for decades prior, with nothing like 88 million views, right? This is how it works. So I think one of the lessons here to men, and I know there's not a whole lot of men here, but is that we need to be standing up and saying some of this stuff much louder than we have been, and much more prominently than we have been at every level of societal reach and influence, in media, outside of media, in faith communities, in schools, in businesses, in labor unions, everywhere. We need more men saying this stuff out loud, so that then when the women say it, and by the way, we can stand with women and partner with women in this effort, but then when women say it, they can't as easily be shouted down as they can be when they're standing alone. And this idea that somehow that women who do speak up are somehow bashing men. This is another point that really, really drives me crazy. And I know many of you too. And I just want to share with you just a little insight into the linguistics of this, because anytime a woman speaks up and challenges men's power on a macro level or even a micro level, you'll often get called names for your troubles, right? And so over the past number of decades, male basher, man hater, ball buster, feminazi, right? How many women in this room have been called one or more of these kind of names? In the last couple of hours? So let me just deconstruct one of those words. I mean, I'd love to spend the whole time that I have talking about language, but I'll just deconstruct one of those words, male basher. Again, I can't stand this. This is, by the way, an old time-honored strategy called kill the messenger, right? So in other words, we don't like what these women are saying because it's making us uncomfortable, it's holding us accountable, it's awkward, it's uncomfortable. So as a result, we're going to call her names and say that she's got an agenda, she hates men, or something like that, so we don't have to listen to what she's saying. It's not a complicated strategy. It's kill the messenger. But male basher, let's talk about that term. If you look in the dictionary under the word bash, as a verb it means to hit or to strike. As a noun it means party. But I don't know the connection. But so therefore a male basher is a violent person, right? So think about this. The women who have been speaking out against violence, harassment, and abuse. The women who are at the forefront of working against violence, they're the bashers, they're the violent ones. But you know what? In the universe created by the term male basher, it's even worse. Because not only in the universe created by that term are women the bashers, but men are the ones being bashed. Now in the real world that I live in, men are assaulting women at pandemic rates all over the world. Men are assaulting other men at pandemic rates all over the world. Yet in the universe created by the term male basher, women are the ones who are the violent ones, and men are the ones who are being violated by them. This is what we might call a double Orwellian whammy. It's turning reality upside down. It's like saying freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, war is peace. The women who are speaking out against violence are the ones who are bashing, and they're the violent ones. But again, like good propaganda, it has an effect. And the effect is a lot of women hear these kind of negative terms, and they think, I don't want to be associated with that. And I don't want to be called these names. And so they're often dancing around, not saying directly, being very polite, saying it's not really a gender issue. There are some, most of the victims are female, most of the perpetrators are male, but it's not really a gender thing because, there are male victims and there are female perpetrators. And I appreciate, I'm not criticizing women for doing this. I know why they often do it. But I think we need more honesty in our public discourse. And I think one of the roles that men can play is to help say some of these things. Now, let me just say, when men do speak up, when men say the kind of things that I've been saying, we do get some pushback. I mean, if you read my Facebook traffic or email or comments on YouTube clips that I'm on, you'd see that men like myself get some pushback, get some really angry, violent language directed towards us sometimes. Like women do, by the way, I know that. And I just want to give you a couple examples of the kind of pushback. So I get called, for example, mangina all the time. I get called a beta male as opposed to an alpha male. Like, why do we have to listen to this beta? Yeah. Recently, I was referred to as Dr. Katz straighted, which I give the person high marks for creativity, if nothing else. But you notice there's a pattern here, and the pattern here is my manhood is being called into question. Why do I have to listen to this guy? Because he's soft, he's a wuss, he's womanly, he's like a woman, which is very similar to the put-downs of women. They're not, why do we have to listen to them? They're women. That's misogyny 101, isn't it? And it's interesting, what's the difference between a presumably adult man, and I say presumably because I don't know, but presumably adult man sitting at his computer aggressing against me, calling me, beta man and, mangina, why do we have to listen to this guy? What's the difference between that and 12-year-old boys calling each other sissy, you throw like a girl, trying to police boys into conformity with narrow definitions of manhood? It's the same thing, isn't it? And this leads me partly to what's so powerful working with someone, someone meaning a group like the BC Lions, is that you can cut right through that. So what are you going to do? Say these BC Lions players are a bunch of wusses, they're a bunch of wimps? You can go right to the issues that we're talking about. In other words, because the criticisms are illegitimate. The criticisms are ridiculous anyways. They're ridiculous all the time, but they're even more ridiculous in this case. And so we can have an honest discussion about issues, about real life, cutting through the name calling and the identity questions that come up inevitably in this work. Don't you think? Amazing how basic some of this stuff is, how basic it is. Now, I'm going to share with you in brief the history of the bystander approach. Now, again, I can't give you the whole thing, and it's going to be a really attenuated version, but the Be More Than a Bystander campaign is built on some work that Tracy referenced earlier. And I think just to give you some highlights of where that work came from, I'll give you a way to situate it. Because what the BC Lions EVA partnership is doing is like really cutting edge and really ahead of the curve. But there's some backstory that I think might be relevant for your information. So let me just tell you, this is how the bystander approach came into the field of gender violence prevention. When I was in graduate school in Boston, back in the early 90s, I approached the director of an institute at Northeastern University called the Center for the Study of Sport and Society. It had been founded in 1984 by a man named Dr. Richard Lapchick with the intent of using the sports culture as a stepping off point to have conversations about social issues, especially racism. So the center was an advocacy institute in the sports culture that combined sports and civil rights activism. Now, Rich Lapchick, the founder, his father was one of the pioneers of the National Basketball Association. He was a player in the 40s in the National Basketball Association. Then he was the coach of the New York Knicks men's basketball team and the coach of the St. John's men's university basketball team in New York City, the father. And he was a white guy who was committed to racial integration ahead of his time. The son, not an elite athlete, but became a civil rights force unto himself. He was one of the organizers of the Olympic boycott of South Africa during the apartheid era and other initiatives. So anyways, I knew about this work, and so I approached Richard Lapchick with the idea of creating a program to train initially university male student athletes to speak out about domestic and sexual violence. My thinking was not that there was a problem in athletics of male athletes assaulting women and girls, although there is a problem in male athletics of male athletes assaulting women and girls. It was the leadership platform that men in the sports culture often have with not just themselves, but with a broader spectrum of men and boys beyond the athletic subculture. And my thinking was, if we open up some space in the heart of some parts of male culture, it'll open up space much beyond it. That was my thinking. Now, the challenge was, what do we do with this? We got funding, by the way, from the federal government, the United States government, to create this model program, and we had this great opportunity. The great opportunity was we were going to work with, at least initially, 9 universities and colleges and to try to pilot this approach, this new approach to advocacy around this issue. Now, for the sake of this mini history, I just want to share with you, using the board here. I'm sorry if people can't see it. It's not going to be that much written on the board. But what we were dealing with was the status quo in gender violence prevention in the 70s and 80s, and I'm making a general statement here, there's probably exceptions, but the status quo of gender violence prevention in the 70s and 80s was mostly focused on women And what were really risk reduction efforts were called prevention efforts. So women were taught, don't put your drink down at a party, look in the back seat of your car before you get in. If you're going to be drinking alcohol, have a buddy system. There's so many things that women and girls were taught. And that was called prevention, but it's not prevention, it's risk reduction. Prevention means going to the root cause of the problem, right? The root cause of the problem is not women and girls. When men were focused on back in the day, it was almost always as perpetrators or potential perpetrators. So the spirit of the message was, you guys better listen up. We know that if you don't listen to people like us, you know that some of you are going to do bad things to women, or you need to know the law. You need to know the law around consent involving alcohol and sex and all that. And it was kind of a finger-pointing thing. I mean, again, I'm just over-dramatizing this, but there was kind of a spirit in which it was like, you guys better listen up, as opposed to a more inclusive sort of positive challenge. What Esther Solar, the founder of Futures Without Violence, refers to as, you want to invite men, not indict them. You want to invite them into the conversation, not tell them that they're bad. Now, again, that's over-dramatizing the status quo, but generally speaking, back in the 70s and 80s, it was men were perpetrators or potential perpetrators. And I knew that that was a problem. It wasn't very effective. And so then our challenge was, how do we do something different? And I had a professor in graduate school at the time, this is the early 90s, who, along with his colleagues, were pioneering this approach to middle school bullying prevention that moved beyond the perpetrator-victim binary and focused on everybody around the kid who's doing the bullying, everybody around the kid who's experiencing the bullying, and they called it the bystander approach. Of course, the bystander approach has its own trajectory from other social justice movements, and it's not an original idea by any stretch of the imagination, but applying it to middle school bullying prevention was a cutting-edge thing back in the late 80s, early 90s. And so what we did is we imported that idea into the domestic and sexual violence field. So instead of focusing on men as perps or potential perps, or women as victims or potential victims, or by the way, women as victims or men as, women as perps and men as victims, we focused on all of us as what we refer to as bystanders. And a bystander in this model was defined as basically anybody who's not a perpetrator or a victim. In a peer culture, an extended peer culture, in a community, I mean, really broad category bystander. And one of the benefits to this category is that it's a pretty universal category for men, for example. So for example, in men, a lot of men see domestic and sexual violence issues as issues. They'll say, yeah, these are important issues, but they're not my issues. That's how most men respond. They'll say, I'm a good guy. I don't rape women. I don't beat my girlfriend or my wife or other women and girls. This is an important issue, but not mine. I'm a good guy. Have you heard men say this? This is like the norm for what men say, right? And so one of the things that I respond is I say, I think we need to raise the bar a little higher for what it means to be a good guy in Canada in 2013. And just saying, I'm not a rapist is not particularly impressive to me. Or just saying, I don't beat my girlfriend is not something guys should be getting high fives for, right? We need a lot more from men, right? And what do we need? We need more men who are willing to start challenging other men and interrupting other men's harassing, abuse, or abusive behavior at every level. Don't you? Don't you think? And so, right. So the bystander category gave us that. It gave us a way to be inclusive and to bring men in and say, yes, it is your issue. Yes, it is our issue. And yes, we are men who live in peer cultures and workplaces and have families, and we have influence with younger men, some of us who are coaches and teachers and fathers and grandfathers. And I'm not a grandfather yet. But anyways, the point is, it's an inclusive category. Now, when I say we need men willing to challenge and interrupt other men's abusive behavior, I don't just mean at the point of attack. Okay? Because that would be a naive way of designing a social change program. It's like, we need men to jump in when they see their friend abusing his girlfriend. We need to pull the guy off. I mean, come on. This is not like superhero model. It's a social justice model. And so if you imagine this really badly drawn triangle as a pyramid, and the tip of the pyramid is a sexual assault incident or a domestic violence incident, but at the base of the pyramid is a set of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that create the cultural foundation and the context for the abusive act to take place. Then you have a much wider range of where we're asking men to start interrupting and challenging each other. Don't you think? So it means, for example, not just at the point of attack does a guy need to challenge his friend, but when his friend makes a really sexist comment, a degrading comment about women or girls who may not even be present. It might be just a group of guys playing poker or something or watching a hockey game, and some guy says, "Oh, those bitches," or something like that, and the other guy says to him, "Hey, what are you saying, man? That's not cool." That's the change that has to happen on every level. Boys and men need to know that if they act out in sexist ways and degrading ways towards women and girls or towards other men and boys, that they will lose status in their peer culture, that they won't be seen as strong men who are proven that they're one of the guys or that they're tough or anything like that, but that they have issues. It'll be seen instead that they have issues, they have problems, not that they are strong men who are modeling a kind of cool manhood. That's nonsense. That's nonsense. But what's been happening though for so long, I think there's a lot of men who are really good men. They haven't had the courage to challenge other men. They haven't had the courage in some ways to speak up and to use their power, if you will, in a constructive way. And I think this is an important piece of this. And one of the reasons why so few men have been willing to do this? Because there are active policing mechanisms in male peer culture by which men keep other men silent. And so men know if I say something, I'm gonna lose status. I'm gonna be unmanned, or I'm gonna maybe be ostracized. I'm not gonna be seen as one of the guys. It's not just individual skill building that needs to happen. In other words, it's not just that individual people, boys and girls, men and women, don't have the skills to intervene. It's beyond that. In male culture, they need permission to intervene. They need permission to say it's okay to speak up and challenge, because you know what? The kid who speaks up and challenges, if you're a boy or a young man and you challenge your fellow man who's making a sexist comment or treating girls and women with disrespect, that's a strong man. That's a strong young man. That's a person of integrity and character, not some soft, going soft kind of guy who's being pussy whipped. All this kind of language that you hear in parts of male culture, don't you think? It takes greater strength. In other words, one of the things that's crazy to me is that guys who speak up and challenge other men are often called wimps, when in fact they are stronger than the men who are calling them wimps. Because if you're a guy, being one of the guys is easy. It's easy. It's one of the easiest things in the world to do, to be one of the guys if you're a guy. Right? What takes strength is to turn to your friends, who you could care deeply about and love, and say, wait, you can't talk like this. You can't act like this. It's not cool. That takes more strength than to remain silent. This is, by the way, so true of racism and anti-racism. If you're a white person going along with sort of white racism, or acting, kids or adults who are acting in racist ways, don't say anything, you just kind of laugh nervously, that takes nothing special. What takes a little bit more special is to say, hey, that's not okay. That's not okay. That's racist, or I'm not comfortable with that language, and could you rethink what you just said, because it's not really cool here. And the same with heterosexism. Heterosexual people who remain silent when other heterosexual people are acting in ways that are oppressive to people across the sexual orientation spectrum. What's special about that? What takes some greater character and greater strength is to fight through your doubts and your anxieties and say something and interrupt that process. And again, this is where men's leadership comes in so powerfully, is because when you have powerful men in every walk of life, not just sports culture, who are willing to say some of this stuff, it becomes normalized. It becomes more okay and more acceptable. So young men growing up start seeing when BC Lions football players are saying this, Winnipeg Blue Bombers football players are saying this, and they're saying it in tandem with, women activists and domestic violence shelters and programs and educational advocacy, outreach people and all that kind of stuff. They're all working together. It's then calling those men names and saying that they're somehow soft, again, as I said earlier, it's a ridiculous point to make. It's ridiculous. So it takes us to the next stage. Let's talk an honest talk about what's going on. And I've found in my work, and I know this is probably true of a lot of the other people, including some of the BC Lions, most guys really, when they get beyond their initial defensiveness, get a lot out of this. Because they know they're policed into conformity with some toxic stuff. They know that men, by the way, are victims of other men's violence in profound ways. It's not just women who are victims of men's violence. I mean, look at the sexual assault and sexual abuse pandemic in male culture. Men sexually assaulting other men and boys. By the way, one of the great things about over the last couple of decades, all these men coming forward and young men coming forward to talk about being sexually abused and holding accountable the men, sometimes powerful men, who are the perpetrators. That's all because of the women's movement. All this great stuff that's happening in male culture, male victims coming forward, is because of the leadership of women and survivors in the women's movement and their advocates. Right? I mean, this is one of the reasons why the men's rights arguments are just so intellectually vacuous as well as morally bankrupt. Because they say they care about men. Well, the people who have been the strongest advocates for men and boys, especially men and boys who are victims of violence, have been feminist women in the battered women's movement and the rape crisis movement. That's who have been the strongest advocates for men and boys for decades and centuries, don't you think? I mean, even the men's health movement, have you heard of the men's health movement? It's a small but growing movement. The men's health movement is directly indebted to the feminist-led women's health movement. There's some of the key figures in men's health, writers, authors, theorists, filmmakers, are all men who have explicitly credit feminist women's leadership for their understanding of how gender is structuring boys' and men's experience such that so many boys and men hurt themselves and have bad health behaviors. And this cuts across class and race and ethnicity, and I appreciate there's some complexities to some of these issues that I'm not accounting for in some of this general talk, but some of this stuff does hold across the board of the socioeconomic spectrum and the racial and ethnic spectrum. Now, that was the bystander idea, bringing men into the conversation who are not abusive, but who can change peer cultures, getting the leadership of men in prominent positions in the sports culture, now in the military, in business, and labor unions. We have a long way to go. We have a lot of work to do. But that was the general idea about changing social norms, right? Changing the norms in male culture that accept this behavior. In other words, by men holding each other accountable because what they're doing is not acceptable is different than saying it's wrong because it's illegal, right? In other words, the old way of thinking is it's don't do this because you're going to get in trouble with the law. The new way of thinking would be don't do this because we don't accept that here. On this team, in this workplace, in this family, in this school, in this peer culture, that's just not cool with us, in addition to the fact that it's probably illegal. But it's also not cool. I want to leave you with, I want to leave you with a clip, okay? It's going to be really short, but it's going to go over my 1 minute. It's going to be 3 minutes, so I'm sorry about that, but I blew it. But thank you. I just want to share with you, because I think this is powerful enough to make it worth, I hope, the extra 2 minutes. But this is a clip. I don't know if anybody has seen this clip, but it is from the Chief of Staff of the Australian Army, David Morrison. And I've been working with the Australian Army now for about 8 months, and I'm actually going to Australia tomorrow to continue that work. And my colleagues and I have been working with them. And the Australian Army is doing some really interesting things. But I think the reason why they're doing these interesting things is because the leadership of this one particular general, who's the second highest ranking member of the Australian military, General David Morrison. And I want to share with you this clip. He issued a public statement on video to the members of the Australian Army after a scandal involving members of his army, male members of the Australian Army, making harassing and sexist email postings, Facebook postings, and a bunch of online misogyny. And David Morrison found out about this, and he was not too pleased, and he made this statement, which then went viral. And I want to share with you because it's an example of how powerful men's leadership can change the conversation. And I'll tie back at the end with the BC Lions, and I'll say goodbye. But I did want to share this with you because it gives us some hope, I think, and a vision for what a healthier society would look like if male leadership would step to the challenge. Okay, so Garnet, if you could roll the Army Chief of Staff, please.
Media and through them the Australian public about ongoing investigations into a group of officers and NCOs whose conduct, if proven, has not only brought the Australian Army into disrepute, but has let down every one of you and all of those whose past service has won and respected our nation. There are limits to how much I can tell you because the investigations into this network by both the New South Wales Police and the ADF Investigative Service are ongoing. But evidence collected to date has identified a group of men within our ranks who have allegedly produced highly inappropriate material, demeaning women, and distributed it across the internet under defence's email networks. If this is true, then the actions of these members are in direct contradiction to every value the Australian Army stands for. By now, I assume you know my attitude to this type of conduct. I have stated categorically many times that the Army has to be an inclusive organisation in which every soldier, man and woman, is able to reach their full potential and is encouraged to do so. Those who think that it is okay to behave in a way that demeans or exploits their colleagues have no place in this Army. Our service has been engaged in continuous operations since 1999 and in its longest war ever in Afghanistan. On all operations, female soldiers and officers have proven themselves worthy of the best traditions of the Australian Army. They are vital to us maintaining our capability now and into the future. If that does not suit you, then get out. You may find another employer where your attitude and behaviour is acceptable, but I doubt it. The same goes for those who think that toughness is built on humiliating others. Every one of us is responsible for the culture and reputation of our Army and the environment in which we work. If you become aware of any individual degrading another, then show moral courage and take a stand against it. No one has ever explained to me how the exploitation and degradation of others enhances capability or honours the traditions of the Australian Army. I will be ruthless in ridding the Army of people who cannot live up to its values, and I need every one of you to support me in achieving this. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. That goes for all of us, but especially those who by their rank have a leadership. If we are a great national institution, if we care about the legacy left to us by those who have served before us, if we care about the legacy we leave to those who, in turn, will protect and secure Australia, then it is up to us to make a difference. If you're not up to it, find something else to do with your life. There is no place for you amongst this band of brothers and sisters.
So imagine a world in which men at all levels were willing to say stuff like this and make it clear where they stood and provide a positive, powerful role model of strength and courage and, an egalitarian, justice-oriented masculinity. Imagine that world. That would be a world where we have a radical diminution of domestic and sexual violence, wouldn't we? Wouldn't we? So that's what we're working towards. Now, let me just finally say, I think that what EVA BC has been able to do in partnership with the BC Lions is really encouraging and groundbreaking. It's way ahead of the curve. By the way, the BC Lions are ahead of every National Football League team. The United States has been, the pro leagues have been incredibly, in my opinion, behind the curve, and they continue to be. But the BC Lions are pioneering an incredible, sort of partnership in the way that you're doing it. And I know it's serving as a model for throughout Canadian Football League teams who can hopefully learn from your example. And then, we're only at the beginning, I think. I mean, it's been incredibly successful to begin with, but it's only the beginning of a process. And I hope and I know that it will continue. And the possibilities of making it normal to hear men talk about these issues in the next generation, for my son's generation. Well, my son hears it at home, so he doesn't have to go out and hear it from the experts out in the world. But for my son's generation, to think that it's normal and expected that powerful, strong men talk like David Morrison, talk like Jamie Terrace or J.R. Rose, that's how the change will happen, don't you think? And so I'm proud to be working with this, effort, if you will, and I look forward to it furthering, deepening ties and communities throughout BC and throughout Canada and throughout the world. And I'm honored to be, leading off for JR, Jamie, and Chris, who are going to be saying a few words about their experiences doing it, because these guys are on the cutting edge. And let me just say one last thing. It's not. I wouldn't say it's, we have to say, oh, it's great, it's, it's so hard what you're doing and so heroic. It's leadership is what it is. It's knowing that these guys have a platform of influence and cultural reach and taking it and using it in a constructive way to address these issues. That's what it is. It's worthy of respect. It doesn't mean we have to revere people and say that they're, greater, God-like. We're all human beings doing our best, and these guys are stepping out, and stepping out sometimes don't get the total support from their peer culture, but you know what? That's what leadership is, isn't it? That's what feminist leadership has known for decades and centuries. You say it and do it because it's the right thing to do, even if it's not popular, because that's what leaders do. Well, they learn it in the sports culture, right? That's an important lesson in sports. It's like you're a leader means you take some risks, and I think it's great that these men are willing to take those risks, and I honor you and I appreciate you, and thank you very much, everybody.